Ow! Greetings, YouTube. This is DecKrash, better known as Brandon. I'm back with another Defiance review. Alright, before we begin, of course, this is chock-a-block full of delicious, tasty spoilers. So if you have not seen the episode yet, I recommend you stop right now, go watch the episode, and then come back and listen to my dulcet tones as I spoil the living daylights out of this. So what we're looking at right now is the next to last episode in Defiance's third season of A Demon in My View. This one was a much simpler, much more compact affair than previous Defiance episodes have gone, and things from the previous episode didn't turn out exactly how I expected, which was in some regards a bit of a letdown, and yet the plot turned in some very interesting directions, and of course some pretty grand directions, both good and not so good. Not talking about saying the plot was bad, I'm just saying things that make you excited and happy and things that are just plain tragic. So let's go ahead and get started. So it picks up almost right after Nolan is taken by the VC to be shipped back to South America. But you find that the convoy that Nolan was the prisoner in has been attacked and ransacked. Now, who of all people stumbles upon this wrecked convoy than Berlin, who's driving a Von Bach truck? They're never clear about what she was doing way out there in the Badlands. It's outside of, at least when you can see the remains of a sign, it shows that it's right outside of what is, I guess, what used to be Oklahoma City. So you see the whole wrecked VC convoy, and she finds Orissa still there and still alive, but pinned under a metal bar. Interestingly enough, despite her feelings about Orissa, I guess somewhere along the line she kind of felt bad about leaving her to die during that episode where the weird architect that was in her brain and Nolan's brain caused him to go into spasms and seizures and into a comatose state, and Doc Yule had to work on them to try to get it out. Of course, she was unsuccessful. But of course, I'm glad to see that Berlin seems to have, in some regards, buried the hatchet with Orissa and manages to rescue her. When they're outside the convoy, they find a bunch of raiders seem to have attacked the convoy, but Orissa is very quick to discover that it was not raiders, that it was actually just made to look like a raider attack. Instead, she finds out that it was Kinsey who had attacked the convoy. Sure enough, we switch scenes and see that Kinsey has managed to rescue Nolan. Not only that, but she's having, of course, Doc Yule as her own personal puppet working for her. And she wants to get the Arc-Tech out of Nolan's head. And Doc Yule, of course, is reticent to do that, but she really doesn't have much of a choice but to obey her. But before she has a chance to do anything, she asks for permission to speak freely and pretty much calls Kinsey a psychopath and says she disgusts her. So Kinsey dismisses her and sets to work on getting the architect out of Nolan's head, despite Doc Yule's warning that the process may kill him. But it seems that the Olmec, being a much more advanced race than the other Votans, seem to have the means to get that Arc-Tech out fairly easily, even though you saw Nolan spazzing out as if he was going to die, and then a few miles away, Orissa collapses and is screaming like whatever the process is doing is causing her agonizing pain. But luckily, Kinsey manages to get the Arc-Tech out, and Nolan, of course, survives. And Orissa says that she can't feel Nolan anymore. She's always, I guess, been aware of his presence. Like I said, this thing is kind of like If you remember that episode of Star Trek: The Next Generation when Captain Picard and Dr. Crusher were taken by the two side that enemy side of that planet that they wanted like partial membership in the Federation, and they implanted them with some weird device at the base of their brain stems that kind of connected them in a telepathic link that they couldn't get out of if they stepped too far away from each other. Then this is kind of like how that Arctech in Nolan and Arissa's brains kind of worked. But now Arissa said she couldn't feel him anymore, so she was worried that he was either dead or something had happened. But they managed to get back to, she and Berlin managed to get back to Defiance and go to the mines where, of course, Kinsey and Tevkin had set up shop. And, of course, we know that Tevkin was overpowered by Kinsey in the previous episode, and we get a glimpse of what she's been doing with him. Seems that blood is thicker than water. She hasn't killed him, but she's been draining his blood, keeping him in a weakened state, tied down in this chair with a bunch of chains. And then she wakes up Nolan and basically wants Nolan to be her little pet. Remember that the OMEC, before the exodus from the Votanist system, their planet only came close to the Votan worlds once every 76 years, and the OMEC, who were more technologically advanced than the other Votans, would descend on the Votan worlds and harvest the Votans in what they simply call the Dread Harvest, take them back to the OMEC homeworld to serve as slaves and sexual playthings, and when they got tired of them, they would, of course, eat them. And she was planning on making Nolan into her personal sexual plaything. And it lasts, okay, I guess, for a few hours, but Nolan is constantly worried about Arissa and is asking questions about Arissa and doesn't seem to pay much attention to Kinsey, even though she ends up having sex with him. And Kinsey, in disgust, knocks Nolan out and then chains him up somewhere deep in the caverns, basically saying, "I would have protected you. You would have been my personal servant. You would have had seniority and rank above all the other slaves. You would have lived an honorable life and died honorably. But no, I guess I'm just gonna have to feed." But fortunately, Irissa and Berlin come and crash the party, and and of course, Kinsey, during the whole time she was playing with Nolan, was lying about where Irissa was. So Nolan was, of course, too smart for that. So anyway, Irissa and Berlin end up crashing Kinsey's party, but Kinsey comes out into the main entrance of the little fortress that she and her father had made for themselves, and begins, of course, lying to Berlin and of course, Irissa. Well, Berlin decides to leave the caves and go back to Defiance to talk to Amanda. Now, I'm actually kind of surprised that Kinsey didn't try to do anything about this. I mean, even though she's not as strong and hardy as her father, who is much older than she is and much stronger, I think she could have easily overpowered both those girls, being an OMEC. Though, of course, handguns tend to be the great equalizer. Maybe that was the kind of thing. She did get shot during the first time you see the OMEC and nearly died. So, anyway, so of course, interesting little reunion with Berlin, going back to Amanda and telling her that that she believes that that Nolan is alive, and what happened with the VC convoy. And Amanda, at first, she doesn't want to talk to Berlin because she still considers her a coward. And, well, honestly, she kind of was, leaving with her boyfriend, her new boyfriend, rather than trying to stay and defend the city after all that Amanda did. I'm still a little sore about that, personally. But anyway, she of course goes and gathers up Nolan's clothes and his badge, goes back to the site of the VC convoy, the remains of it, and burns Nolan's clothes, Nolan and Arissa's clothes, to make it look like, and with certain bodies. I don't know where they procured the bodies, they don't say, but they burn the clothes of the bodies in there to make the VC, because they know that they're going to go and try to find out what happened to their convoy. So to make them really believe that Nolan was killed and this really was a Raider attack, because Berlin says, if no, it wasn't Berlin, it was Amanda who basically said, well, if you can figure out that this attack, if you and Arissa can figure out that this attack was not done by Raiders, then the VC aren't going to be stupid either. And then and who do you think they're going to set their sights on for revenge? So I'm hoping this has, will, of course, allay the fears of the VC, but only time will tell. So anyway, now of course she goes. Now of course we switch back, of course, to Arissa, who's searching the caves for Nolan. Nolan, who's been hanging like a piece of meat in that private cavern of Kinsey's, manages to get loose with his, of course, soldier skill, and manage to find Tevkin. But while he's trying to get Tevkin out of his own chains, Tevkin's kind of spilling the beans about the reason why Kinsey is acting the way she does. Of course, we know from previous episodes that the OMEC have a particular bone to pick with the VC, because it's because of the VC that the ships the OMEC had, the ARC ships that the OMEC had made, were sabotaged, and the only surviving OMEC are now aboard the harvester ship that's in orbit around the Earth, even though those are still millions of OMEC. And so Tevkin feels that it's his fault, because the only thing that kept him going that entire time, they were trying to find out where the Votan's ARC ships had gone. It was just desire for revenge that fueled him. He instilled that desire for revenge in Kinsey, but now him being on Earth and seeing the peaceful lives of that the Votans have lived, and the results of their own anger and hatred, and he's changed his mind. But Kinsey, of course, being fueled by her own father's bedtime stories, I guess you could say, of the revenge that he wants to exact, has never changed her mind and now considers her father weak. So finally, Nolan manages to get him mostly free, but Kinsey intervenes and knocks him clean across the room. But before she can eat him, that jaw-unhinging thing they do will never stop being disturbing. Arissa steps in and, for some weird reason, empties all her clips, firing warning shots at Kinsey. I'm, maybe this is just, I gotta stop and step aside for a moment and just kind of criticize the wisdom of the writers for Arissa to have done that. Because you're dealing with some sort of creature who is much stronger and much faster than any humans or Votans. I would have at least done a couple of warning shots, but then again, that's just me. But I still think that this was a fairly poor plot moment. And it is a point of criticism for this episode, because it makes Arissa especially vulnerable after the whole thing, even though Arissa doesn't come into any real harm. So anyway, she fires a bunch of warning shots at Kinsey, or I guess they were intended to be warning shots, and tells her to step away from Nolan. And Nolan throws a pickaxe at Tevkin, allowing him to finish freeing himself from the chains that are around his legs. Tevkin, though weakened, seems to have plenty of fight in him, because though Kinsey's trying to say, kill them, do what do what our species is meant to do, Tevkin's not having any of it, and basically gets into a full-out fight with Kinsey, and telling Nolan and Arissa, saying, this isn't your fight, leave. And of course, even though he's weakened, a weakened Tevkin is still worlds stronger than a fully powered Kinsey. And he manages to subdue her, holding her at knife point by her neck, forcing her to promise that she'll go back to the ship and obey him. Well, while I'm sitting there just going, she's going to stab you. She's totally going to stab you. And of course, she does. And he dies. And unfortunately, there's really not much that Nolan and Arissa can do but run, at least for the time being. And this results in a really odd moment in the story. Even Kinsey is grieved at what she does and just falls to her knees wailing in grief. And there's this really weird flashback to 1973. outside of the Gillespie 873 beta system. I think I can't remember the exact name, the exact star, but it shows inside the harvest ship. Kinsey and Tevgen, I guess, in happier days, or at least when they were still trying to search for the Votan fleet or location and the world they had gone to. And what Tevgen is doing is scanning radio bands, and all all that Kinsey is saying is this is a hopeless chase. Finally, Tevkin stumbles upon an old radio broadcast of Rockin' Robbins, and they realize, of course, this isn't any language of the Votans, and they realize there's a planet in a galactic sense that's not too far away. And so they start rejoicing with this weird kind of Olmec rejoicing where they're putting their elbows together and sticking out their tongues. It's really kind of funny to watch. But anyway, and then it returns to the present. Kinsey doing some strange ritual with a knife, and which she plunges into Tevkin's stomach and carves upward, and then removes his heart. And then she says, "I take your power into mine." And then she proceeds to eat his heart. Kind of an interesting ritual. Reminds me a little bit of the Aztecs, but they did it to a still living victim. Well, anyway, so to make a long story short, she goes back on board the ship and then proceeds to awaken all the Olmec that are in cryosleep. It's basically saying, I speak to you in the language of this world, this new world. The dread harvest begins. And that's kind of how the episode ends, leaving 2 more episodes up next. The Awakening and Upon the March We Fittest Die. It's going to be a very interesting couple of episodes, I do believe, now that the you-know-what has really hit the fan. So, wow. This episode was pretty short, sweet, and to the point, but the results at the end are something that it's basically the whole episode was a lead into the final battle, I guess you can say. So, I can't wait to see what's next. I am a little upset that things didn't quite turn out the way I'd hoped. We didn't get a chance to see South America. I thought maybe there was going to be some big story arc with Nolan being put on trial and all this kind of stuff. But no, I mean, the turn of events was much more interesting than I expected in this regard, because at least it focused very heavily on what was going to happen involving the Olmec. And I felt, of course, when you see in the first couple of episodes of the season, seeing that huge panned out view of just all those millions of Olmec in those sleeping pods, you knew that something big was going to happen. And especially with the unexpected finishing of the whole Ram Tak storyline, which finished off his whole detachment pretty quick and easy, more or less. All that was left now was, of course, to tie up the loose ends involving the Olmec. But it seems like this threat is a whole lot more than a whole lot more clear and present than even the VC or going to be. I mean, if the VC had managed to get into Defiance and Ron Tak had done what he had done, I kind of wonder how things would have turned out. Maybe Kinsey wouldn't have been able to make her move. There's a lot of maybes, and of course, that's not the direction the writers took, thankfully. We want to see Defiance fall. It was bad enough to see the arch blown nearly away. So, like I said, I can't wait to see what's going to happen next. But that's one thing this show is immensely good at, is keeping you wondering what's going to happen next. I mean, I haven't been so interested and invested in a series since really the 4400, in which every episode answered like 1 or 2 questions, but raised 4 or 5 more. So, This one, because it didn't go the direction I had hoped, despite the fact it still went in an interesting direction. And also because of that really weird moment where Irissa just emptied her whole gun and seemed to hit nothing. And it just seemed to be that there was a warning shot, and I'm like, you don't empty your entire pistol with a warning shot. I think it was just a moment of kind of bad writing. I feel that I have to dock it at least 1 point in the 1 to 10 scale. And so I give this episode a solid 7 or 7.5. Because just the way it ended still gave it some really good credit there, and is a good setup, I think, for the last couple of events that are going to happen in the next 2 weeks. So that's my take on this episode of Defiance, ladies and gentlemen. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them down in the doobly-doo. As always, keep it civil. Trolls are not tolerated. And I will be back next week and the week after for the last couple of episodes. And, well, I know it's a bit early to say anything, but here's hoping they make a 4th season out of this. But I'm really hoping to see what's going to happen right here and right now and focus on the present. Every season of Defiance thus far has been great. First season, did a great beginning setting up that world. The second season just took everything from the first season, amped it up to 11, and then the third season is bringing even a bigger, a bigger threat. It's just bringing in these big threats to the season, to the city. So see how this one wraps up, if it wraps up. I know how the first season ended with some story threads left hanging, and then of course the second season did too, with Nolan and Arissa again in some precarious situation. So let's see how it happens next. Thank you once again for watching, guys, and as always, this is DecKrash, better known as Brandon. Stay lucky and stay blessed. Take care.